Nice.
Hello there.
Welcome, Stefan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I think I can just start with a quick introduction and we can move on to our discussion then. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining. It's a pleasure. My name is Liza. I'm the community manager of the World Vapers Alliance, and this is the Twitter Space discussion series of Vapers Voice. Today we have a very special episode since usually we talk about harmful and counterproductive regulations imposed on vaping, but today we have a victory to celebrate. Before we start with our discussion, I just want to ask you to tweet out about our podcast and also ask your questions in a thread so that I can read them out in the end. Alternatively, you can also click the request button and I'll give you some time to speak in the Q&A part. I'm moving on to the topic of the day now. Last February, Sweden's Ministry of Social Affairs announced plans for a vape flavor ban. And we know that previously Sweden has taken a progressive stance on other harm reduction products, which resulted in lowest smoking rates and actually lung cancer rates in Europe. That's why the proposal on flavor ban took many vapers by surprise and also caused a lot of protests. And last week, we have learned that news that fortunately the Swedish Parliament voted against the ban on vape flavors. And to talk about this huge victory, we have invited Stefan Mathisson, journalist, activist, the editor of Vejpkollen. Welcome, Stefan, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. As I said, it's a pleasure to be here and talk about something pleasant for once in a while.
Absolutely. We also have our own Michael Landl, who is the director of the World Vapers Alliance. Thank you, Michael, for your time today.
Hello.
I will start with Stefan with my first question. And Stefan, can you kindly elaborate on the whole process before the flavor ban was finally and fortunately declined? How do you think policymakers perceive vaping in Sweden, and what do you think contributed to their final decision?
Well, I think it's not a straightforward issue, really. But in general, the story is like this. The flavor ban in Sweden has actually been discussed within different parliamentary groups and stuff like that for like almost 3 years now. I wrote my first article on this in 2019. So the discussion has been going on. The problem with the discussion, according to me at least, is that politicians in Sweden generally did not know much about vaping at all, but they are or have become quite familiar with the term harm reduction within tobacco, and that is because of like snus use in Sweden, and that snus is a big commodity here, and for that reason, it wasn't really the step to talk about vaping wasn't that far away. So I think that's where it started with for politicians in Sweden. And then when the flavor ban came, lots of them actually knew about the issue, but it wasn't that deep. So I think that was the groundwork here in Sweden. So compared to other countries where harm reduction isn't really a big issue for politicians. In Sweden, it was already something they knew about. That didn't mean, though, that all the politicians in Sweden, or like the majority in the parliament, were actually against the flavor ban. When I wrote when I did some kind of survey among the politicians 2 years ago, or 2 years ago, I found that a majority was actually for a flavor ban, which was kind of worrying for us vapers. But you still realize that they knew a bit about the subject by then, and they started to think about it. And then other things that actually I think made the most difference here is that the parliament, let's start like this: the government in Sweden is not a majority government. It cannot make decisions on its own. It needs to negotiate everything with other parties, and usually this is a social democratic government from the left side of the political field. They need to negotiate with the center and right side parties in Sweden. So any decision they want to make, like for example a flavor ban, needs to be negotiated, or it will be stopped by a different suggestion from one party that can gather some kind of majority. And that is what happened here in Sweden. There was a different stance on tobacco policies from the other parties, which was clear just over a year ago that they did not want a prohibitionist stance on tobacco products or nicotine products in Sweden. They wanted to at least explore the options of harm reduction within the tobacco policies. So all these things together made the environment for stopping this flavor ban quite good, actually, when you look back on it. But during the process, it was quite nerve-wracking to watch it.
Stefan, if I may jump into here, before we get into the process, because you said something very interesting where I'm curious and would like to ask a question, because as you said, in many countries, we even need to start with the basics and explaining politicians the concept of harm reduction. But clearly in Sweden, they already understood it. But nevertheless, at least some parties want to ban flavors. And I'm still not sure what's the underlying reason for that. Do they not see vaping as part of harm reduction, or are there any other reasons?
I think it's a little bit of both. If you look at, you have to look at some kind of ideological stance on this issue. Like for most of the parties on the right, like the conservatives and the liberals, usually the liberals, they see any kind of prohibition as something bad. I mean, if you're going to prohibit anything, do it with real care. So that's one thing. But if you look on the left side of the field, where we have the Social Democrats and the Left Party, and we have the Environmental Party, actually, which is kind of a weird party in this. They're both left and right, everything. But I think the reasons, like for the Social Democrats, they are basically the prolonged arm of tobacco control in Sweden. From the Public Health Agency, from the different organizations that are active in this discussion. Their stance, of course, is that we need to protect children from nicotine addiction right now. Earlier it was tobacco addiction, now it's nicotine addiction. And they have never, ever viewed, like, for example, snus as a harm reduction product. They consider that a harmful product. And they want to kind of measure that in with every kind of regulation. For the Left Party, they have kind of the same idea about snus and harm reduction, but they also have a really strong resentment against tobacco companies per se. They don't want to support tobacco companies in any way. And even though by the end of this discussion, the Left Party actually admitted that vaping is a smoking cessation device for many people, and that big tobacco companies aren't necessarily all involved in this as much as smaller players like vape shops and vape companies. So they kind of changed their stance during the years here, and for the more difficult thing to understand was like the Liberal Party, like the Christian parties and the base Liberal Party in Sweden. They were kind of a bit unsure on what they were going to say about flavors, but they really their stance was, in the end, that we weren't ready for flavor bans in Sweden yet. So it might come up later. But they wanted to know more about the products, and they wanted to know more about the health effects of both nicotine pouches and e-cigarettes and snus and stuff like that. So in the end, I think what turned them was, if the government comes with a proposition and they are basically against everything the government does, they're going to vote no anyway. It's easy to do that. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think
it makes sense. There is definitely a part of politicians who just want to ban everything, and probably
yes.
we won't convince them with any science or arguments. I think it's better to focus on those you mentioned last, who are kind of in the middle and not sure.
Yeah.
And I think also that was part of the reason why the flavor ban was struck down, right? Because all those middle ground parties voted against.
Exactly. That was the key. And much of that kind of stems. I don't think it wasn't much of a harm reduction issue in reality. I think it was just as much about, poking a finger in at the government, because the government is a minority in the parliament, and it would be very hard to explain to voters on the right side why they would let anything pass that the government gives us a proposition. So it's much politics as well. But of course, that there's another important thing as well, that the opposition, those who basically voted this flavor ban down, last year they agreed that they wanted a new policy for tobacco regulation in Sweden, and they made it clear in the parliament that is what they would do if they come to power this year. This is an election year as well. So I think we're going to have more discussions about flavor bans within these parties, and I think they'll probably, come to some kind of conclusion where vaping is actually a part of a solution to the remaining smoking problem in Sweden. Definitely. But I think we're going to have some more fights coming in this field. Because of that, as you said, they weren't really sure what they're going to think about flavors. But they still understand that tobacco harm reduction is a thing. So I think that's a good standpoint.
Yep. Thank you, Stefan. And that actually brings me to my next question, because WVA was very actively involved in spreading the word about the importance of flavors, especially in Sweden and in the Netherlands, as flavor bans were part of the discussion at the time. And I wanted to ask Michael, because there are some more of the fights expected in the future, why is it important to be loud and active in the future, and why it was important back then? And could you tell also our listeners a little bit about our Flavors Matter campaign?
Sure. I mean, the first part of the question is rather easy to answer, why it's important, because I think nobody else will fight our fight for our right to vape. If vapers don't raise their voice and be loud against those kind of regulations, nobody else will. So I think it's quite important that at least those consumers who are already using it, or those who understand the concept of harm reduction, are as loud as possible and raise their voices as much as possible. And obviously, that's basically all we do with all our campaigns, to make it as easy as possible for consumers to get attention and to contact their politicians. And unfortunately, as we know, it's not just Sweden. Flavors are under attack in many countries. And therefore, we came up with kind of the idea of a rapid response campaign called Flavors Matter, where basically we go to countries where flavor bans are discussed or already proposed in the political process. So we went to the Netherlands and Belgium already, and obviously to Sweden. And the general concept is always very similar. It's a mix of an online campaign and offline campaign. So online, basically, we try to make it as easy as possible to contact for vapers their politicians and point them to the right person as well. So we have a part on our website where with one click vapers can tell their own stories. So how vaping helped them, or in that case, why flavors matter and how important they are to stay away from cigarettes, and directly tell to politicians, because I think our own testimonies are the most powerful tools we have, especially what Stefan already mentioned, for those who are not sure, the politicians who don't know to what side to go to hear from actual people and their success stories. But obviously, it's also important to directly engage with politicians. That's different in a lot of countries, sometimes more successful, sometimes less successful. In Sweden, for example, we wrote an open letter. We delivered that to all of the committee members who basically made the first decision before it was voted in the parliament. But normally they are following this. So we sent them an open letter with all the scientific evidence, testimonials, everything in there, why they should vote against it. And then obviously on the ground, it's also important to show presence. So we held a protest in front of the parliament in Stockholm. Stefan was fortunately also there. There were consumers, vape shop owners, and we marched around the parliament to show that this decision have consequences for actual people. And this is what we basically try to do in all those countries where flavor bans are coming up. And as Stefan also said, the fight is not over, so we need to stay loud and keep loud also in Sweden to make sure that, first of all, on the EU level, they don't suddenly change their position, but also within the country when the elections are done.
That's right. Thank you, Michael. And I actually want to ask Stefan now, because Stefan, you mentioned that there will be some future fights expected about this, and obviously there will be some anti-vaping or anti-flavor policymakers who will be opposing vaping or flavors. But do you think there can be any positive expectations in terms of, encouraging vaping to be perceived as a harm reduction method in Sweden? So do you think there is a hope for a more positive conclusion?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, a big like the proposition here for the flavor ban proposition here actually made people come together in Sweden. I mean, we're a small market, and the companies are small. We aren't that many vapers in compared to smokers or even snus users. But I definitely think the future is looking brighter than it did before, even though the vape shops have difficulties with everything here. I mean, it's not just flavor bans coming around. It's lots of other issues that are coming, like registration fees and taxes and stuff like that. And they're already in place, many of them. But I think for the future, I think this fight from vapers and companies together. I mean, they also the Swedish manufacturers actually had a similar site as the World Vapers Alliance, where they made it easy for consumers to contact politicians. And they had like 3,000 responses that came directly into Parliament and different politicians, which actually made the Social Democrats burst out in some kind of fury that those vapers that contacted them weren't real. They actually said that vapers are such a small number that can never be organized like this, something like that. There was like a really insane statement from the government. So yeah, I think vapers coming together, companies organizing, is going to help this issue a lot in Sweden, much more than it would like 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah, future is looking brighter. I think we need here in Sweden, since we have snus, we need to find alliances as vapers with other groups in this this political environment. I mean, there's lots of groups who are fighting for a more sensible regulation when it comes to drugs and nicotine and stuff like that. We need to ally ourselves with them and learn from them, and they need to learn from us how to make this work. Because I mean, if you look at the prohibitionists here in Sweden, they are basically part of the government, and they are sponsoring groups like the state, the public health agency is sponsoring the groups that actually put forward this flavor ban. I mean, so the fight isn't far from over, and I think the organizations built and the networks built from this flavor ban discussion will be really valuable in the future.
Yeah, I also think that Sweden is actually a best case example of the power of the community, kind of, because sometimes we underestimate our own influence or our own voices and the weight it has. And I think Sweden showed that if all those groups you mentioned come together, you can make a difference. And obviously we have powerful vaping enemies, but I think this is the best real life showcase that you can change things, because without the voices of consumers, but also the vape shops involved, I think this flavor ban would have gone through. And then we will, if nobody raises their voice, then we are ending up with the full kind of prohibitionist approach if nobody stands against that.
Totally agree. Yeah.
I mean, that's really definitely a good case of showcasing the powers that consumers have. And this time we won in Sweden, Michael, but I also have one more question. Flavor bans are a threat in many other countries, including the EU member states too. So what would be your message to policymakers? Why do flavors matter? And maybe also just an encouragement note to consumers too, because they should take an example from the community in Sweden and stand for vaping in their own countries.
Yeah, I mean, for us consumers, that's quite obvious. Unfortunately, politicians don't listen often enough, and they don't realize that flavors are a gateway out of smoking, and flavors are important for adults too. I mean, it's quite clear. We have flavored ice cream. We once handed out in a protest flavorless ice cream, and it turned out that adults want those flavors as well. And obviously what politicians also often forget are the unintended consequences of such bans or full prohibition. Flavor bans will push a lot of current vapers back to smoking or to the black market. And we already have real life experience with this. Estonia, for example, implemented a flavor ban 2 years ago already. And the Tholos Foundation did a survey asking vapers what kind of flavors they use now if they switch fully to tobacco. And it turned out that 60% are still using some kind of flavor. So prohibition doesn't work. It just pushes people to the black market or do it at home. And mixing their own things, which can be dangerous if there is not enough knowledge. So it has unintended consequences. Politicians need to think of, and they forget about that too often, I think. And what Stefan also already mentioned is it is important for us vapers, I think, to get out of our own bubble as well. So it's very important to I don't know, inform the general public about harm reduction and the disastrous consequences smoking has, and that there is a solution other than just plain bans or something like that. And obviously asking about the future battles, I think it will at least in the next 1, 2, 3 years circle around the flavor topic in a lot of different countries. And also when we think about the European Union, where the Tobacco Products Directive update is coming up, there are already the signs on the wall that the flavor bans will be an issue. And we didn't promote it yet, but since yesterday, our petition is online against flavor bans and other restrictive regulation. So I encourage everyone to go to worldvapersalliance.com and their Back Vaping Beat Smoking campaign, and there you find all the information about that. And please signed a petition, because we will deliver those signatures end of the year to the MEPs and want to show that it is an issue for a lot of people, and we need to avoid those disastrous unintended consequences of bad vaping regulation.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you for such an interesting discussion. I really hope to have more and more discussions like this, where we actually celebrate some victories. Stefan and Michael, I just want to ask you for final notes, if you have anything you add that you wanted to say and didn't have a chance to. Otherwise, if our listeners want to ask their questions, they can request to speak, and I will give you some time to speak or tweet out about your questions. So yeah, Stefan, maybe we can start with you. If you have any concluding notes or anything you wanted to say and didn't have a chance to, feel free to.
Well, yeah, I think we covered most of the important parts. I think, like as a consumers, I mean, there are lots of fights that we can fight as consumers, but I think one important thing to remember is that we can't get other people to fight for us. I mean, one big thing as a consumer is to contact politicians and tell your story, but also to encourage organizations that can actually fight for you to make other people fight for you. I mean, that was the situation in Sweden. I mean, not just vapers were engaged in this. I mean, snus users or like snus companies were involved as well. I mean, there's a lot of action going on within the what do you call them? The convenience stores that also sell e-cigarettes and pouches and stuff like that. So I think it's important to make other people fight for you, because you cannot win a fight like this all by your own, or consumers cannot win this all by their own. They need to be supportive of other parties as well. So I think that's important to stress. And also, of course, one way of doing this is by financing organizations that actually try to make a difference. So you can do this by Patreon sites. For example, I run Vejpkollen by Patreon, and you can support the NNA Sweden movement in Sweden. For example, you have similar movements in other countries as well. Like NNA Sweden here, and they're called different things in different countries here in Sweden, or in Scandinavia. In Norway we have one, Denmark we have Datafo. All of these organizations, they need support to make this work. So that's important to